Welcome to the professor's lecture on Weber's Individual and Family Stress and Crises, Chapter 3. Now, in this module, you will read the text, Chapter 3, watch this lecture as you're doing now, take the quiz on the lecture. Then you will read a short, really short, it's like a page-and-a-half book review on Kusa's book, who was the author of The Profile of Trouble. You will watch 3 videos. One is about Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems model. The second is about the ecosystems model. It applies it a little bit better to families. And the third is a short video about family systems. They're all relatively short videos. You'll also watch a movie. Now look, you're going to watch a movie anyway, right? So you might as well watch a movie about family stress this week. So I've given you some choices of 5 movies that you could watch this week during your movie time, right? And so pick a movie, sit down, spend an hour and a half, watch the movie, and then write up a 1-page paper that applies some of what you're learning. Maybe the profile of trouble, truncated roller coaster, family ecosystems model, to the family in the movie that you watched. And then upload that to the assignment site. But also you're going to then cut the contents and paste it into the discussion board. So it's not like I'm giving you extra work besides watching a fun movie. Well, not fun, but interesting movie. And you'll then use that for the discussion board as well. So it's both an assignment and a discussion board. Does that make sense? Discussion boards are due Wednesday, so you want to have this movie watched by now or at least soon, and then write this 1-page paper. Make sure you cite some of the stuff that you're learning from the book or from the videos or wherever, and then give a citation for those using APA style. Okay? Don't make it a big deal. It only needs to be a page, or if you really are ambitious, a couple pages. I'm not looking for a lot. I just want to know that you watched the movie and that you had a sense of why maybe this family was one that stuck out to me in terms of the material that we're learning. You can also use anything from Chapter 1 or Chapter 2 or any of the videos you've watched thus far. Okay? With that said, this is going to be a fairly short lecture, and so you're going to compensate for that by watching the movie. The other thing to know about these 3 models are they're older models, and a lot of the newer models, while based upon them, have expanded upon these ideas and made them better. And so these are not models that you will be, theoretical models, that you'll be using routinely because they're outdated for the most part. However, I really wanted to go through them with you so that you understand the history of the stuff that we're going to be doing in Module 4. Okay? So don't stress about this chapter as much as you really need to get to know the stuff in the future chapters, because that's going to apply to your work as social workers with families in crisis. Okay, moving on to slide 2. So the profile model, profile of trouble model. Notice this diagram. There are essentially 4 profiles where a family experiences stress, A, in upper left-hand corner, and then kind of came back to the level that they were after the crisis was over at a level of previous functioning. B, they come back from the crisis and are doing even better than they were before the crisis. And sometimes, if you're a really good social worker, you can parlay that crisis or use that crisis to help the family improve their overall functioning. Crises typically precipitate positive changes in one's life. And think about that for yourself. If you aren't comfortable with the way things are, chances are not much is going to change. However, if you don't like the way things are, you've thrown into crisis, you'll make some improvements so that you won't be like that in the future, right? C, lower left-hand corner, the person or family has a crisis and comes back to a level of functioning that is not where they were before. They're functioning worse. And then in D, we see a family or an individual who's going through multiple crises and not having a chance to recover from any of those crises before they hit the next one. We know families like that. Perhaps you grew up in a family like that. Somebody dies, and then there's a loss of income, and then somebody becomes homeless, and then because they're homeless, the kids start doing poorly in school, and then the kids start acting out, and it's crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis with no chance for recovery in between. Let's delve a little bit deeper into this, okay? Next slide. So, in this model, you see, it's hard to see in this picture, but there are several vectors or points along that graph. There's an A, a B, a C, and a B. Well, let's go through this. I'll show you what I mean. So A, the very first point, the top left, before the crisis happens, is the normal interaction or the level of organization of the family pre-crisis. So that level is determined by the amount of consciousness and acceptance by each family member of each other and their role in the family. It's also predicted by the extent to which the family members are working towards the good of the family and towards the good of each individual. Third, how much the family found satisfaction. So a really high functioning family is very satisfied with their family. And then fourth, whether the family had a sense of direction and was moving in that direction. Some families are just aimless, just kind of existing day to day. But when a family really has a sense of purpose and direction, they know what they're doing and know why they're doing it, and everybody's moving in a certain direction, they tend to function higher. So in this model, families were divided into three categories. So Crise thought of them as better than average, average, and below average. Fairly simplistic, but it was the first model. Next slide, please. B is the point at which the initiating cause takes effect. Now remember, the stress and the crisis are two different things. So we can experience a stress and kind of function for a while, but then something hits us and it becomes overwhelming and too much. It's the straw that broke the camel's back, right? And that throws us into crisis. So B is not the point at which the stress occurs, but rather when the impact or the crisis occurs. Does that make sense? So one may become jobless, but have 3 months of savings, and so they're thinking to themselves, it's okay, I lost my job, I got time to find a new one. But 6 months into it, now they're out of savings and no job prospects, and then they're in a crisis. Does that make sense? Okay, let's move on to C then. Next slide. C is the point at which family interaction drops. It's the lowest point of the crisis, the bottom. After that bottom, recovery can begin, also known as rock bottom, right? So the family now has fallen into crisis, and at the deepest point of that crisis, that's C. Now D in Crise's model, the profile of trouble model, is the point of recovery. We've already talked about this a little bit, but families have 4 ways of recovering from the crisis. One is some families, you see at the upper left, return to the previous level of functioning. 2, some families function better than they were previously. Maybe the family got more income from their job, or found a better house than they had before. Or maybe because they had to delve into this crisis mode, they reorganized themselves and now are functioning at an even higher level. Third, some families just don't make it back to where they were. This crisis is so deep and so powerful and so impactful that they're now functioning at a worse level than they were before the crisis. Better than at the bottom of the crisis, but still not to where they were. And then fourth, some families, just as they're recovering, have another crisis. So just as they're recovering from the death of a parent, then the other parent loses their job. And just as that parent finds a job, then they can't afford to pay rent because they got so many back bills and have to declare bankruptcy. So they're not able to recover anywhere near their previous level because these crises keep happening. Next slide, please. E is the angle of recovery. So you'll notice in that angle there is a measurement, right? And the angle of recovery, the size of the angle, the smaller versus bigger the angle, is the length of time it takes to recover. So a smaller angle means a shorter time of recovery, a larger angle, a longer time of recovery. And you'll notice that some families snap back quickly, and some families really struggle. And it also depends on the level of the crisis, the severity of the stressor that impacted them. And it also depends on the family's ability to cope and the resources surrounding them. So some families will have a crisis and snap back pretty quickly. Other families will have a crisis and take longer to recover. So that's the angle of recovery. Now, our next slide moves us into the Hill's roller coaster model. So let's move on. So Hill, who will become even more important in the next chapter because he then develops ABCX model out of this roller coaster profile of adjustment. Hill develops, based upon Koos's work, the roller coaster profile of adjustment. He stated that each responsible member of the family experiences a roller coaster pattern of personal shock, disorganization, recovery, and then readjustment. And he wrote about 9 periods of readjustment. Now, keep in mind that Hill is writing about military families. So in the military family at his time, which is in the 1940s, 1950s, families would lose their father because it was primarily men in the military, right? The father would go off into deployment and then would come back and then would go off to deployment again. And so when you look at this model, think about stress through the lens of losing the father or the patriarch or the male breadwinner to frequent deployments or deployment after deployment. And that's where these 9 stages come from. So the 9 stages are the pre-family crisis level of organization, where they were before. This sounds like Koos, doesn't it? The anticipatory reactions and preparations for the first stressor. So they know that this father is about to leave to be deployed to battle, and so they're anticipating it. The reaction to the first stressor, or the first disorganization of the family. The adjustment process. So how does the family adjust when the father's deployed? The level of organization after reorganization and adjustment is complete. Then the father's now returned for a period of time, and now he's going to get redeployed. And so it's the anticipation and preparation for the second stressor. Then the reaction to that second stressor. 8, the reorganization process. And then 9, the level of reorganization. So let's delve a little bit deeper into this. Now keep in mind, this is less important than what's about to happen in chapter 4. So don't get too bogged down in the details. Don't worry about this too much. It will appear on the midterm, but it's probably not as important for you to know for your work as what's coming next in the 4th chapter. So the pre-crisis level of organization. So a family has a level of adaptability, they're integrated, and the marriage is whatever it is. Hopefully it's well adjusted. So this is what Hill considered to be the most important factors, these 3 things: adaptability, integration, and marital adjustment. So by these he means, number 1, adaptability, previous success in meeting family crises. The predominance of non-materialistic goals, so goals other than money, right? Flexibility and willingness to shift roles. It should read flexibility, not flexibility, and willingness to shift roles. Responsibility by all the members to perform the duties and sharing of control and decision. So that's adaptability. Second, integration. The willingness to sacrifice their personal interests, pride in the family, emotional unity, and high participation in joint activities. In other words, they are functioning well together. And then marital adjustment is the ability of the marriage team to avoid or resolve conflicts. In other words, is the marriage team working well together? Next slide. The anticipatory reactions and the preparation for the first stressor. Not all stresses are predictable. Not all families will experience this second period of the model. Some families don't have time to adjust to stress. But when they do, the manifestations include kind of an emotional numbness or an emotional shock, worry or anxiety, and some families are just kind of calm about it. It's a period of getting ready for the stressor and preparing in advance to deal with what's about to happen. Next slide, please. Now, the first stressor, or the first disorganization. It's the immediate reaction to the stressor that is disorganizing the family. This is the crisis period. There are positive reactions which result in good adjustments, maybe excitement or feelings of unreality or calm, while there are also negative reactions which result in poor adjustment, strong negative emotions, anger, sadness, fear, emotional upset, or a kind of numbness, just not even dealing with it. Next slide, please. Then there's the adjustment process, or the recovery. So now the family has to reorganize their roles, reallocate duties, and change responsibilities to adapt to the stress and to the loss of this person. After recovery is complete, the balance of the family, or the equilibrium, or the disequilibrium, think about it as a seesaw. When you have equilibrium, the seesaw is balanced, but when you have disequilibrium, it's unbalanced. So after the stress happens, a good adjustment requires healthily reorganizing the family roles, shifting duties and responsibilities, and then addressing the emotional reactions in ways that are healthy and don't leave emotional scars. Next slide, please. Now comes a second impending disaster. Remember, Hill was studying the leaving and returning of soldiers to families and the stress that caused as he developed this model. Sometimes the anticipatory reaction of this next phase is positive. Sometimes it's joyful. Sometimes there's no reactions at all, but sometimes it can be negative. Next slide, please. So how does the family respond to the second stressor, the second disorganization? When the families had an attitude of indifference, I don't care, they had a tougher time adjusting to the stress. Some families actually became more organized, but then once the honeymoon of the reorganization was over, the family dropped in organization. And then recovery for healthier families was quicker after the second stressor than after the first. Next slide, please. Now we've got the second adjustment, right? So now they're reorganizing for the second time. It's a gradual readjustment to the family living, followed by a new level of reorganization. So now the family has to reorganize themselves in a new way after all the changes and the stress that they've been through. Now, the level of reorganization is, families can recover in multiple ways, and this again is going to sound like coups. They can recover to an organization level that was higher than they were previous, equal to, or lower than the level of organization at the time the stress occurred. So let's look at these various roller coasters for a minute in the next slide, okay? We'll go through the diagrams a bit. Here you can see on the right-hand side the diagrams, on the left-hand side the 9 phases. Unfortunately, my head is in a bad place, so let me see if I can move that. No, I can't. Well, you have to trust me on this because you can't see the bottom right because of my head. But at the top, you have the good adjustment to separation, and then a good adjustment to the reunion. So you see they have the first crisis, then they recover, a second crisis, and they recover, and they stay on track throughout. Now on the second one, where my head is blocking, they have a good adjustment to separation, but a poor adjustment to reunion. Now you can imagine in some military families that the husband is deployed and they get through it, and now they're functioning even better because they had to reorganize in the absence of the mother in this case, because the modern military has female soldiers as well. So now they're doing a little bit better, but then the second one happens and the family falls apart. They're not doing as well. So you can see how they have a poor adjustment to the reunion. And you can imagine that when a spouse or a parent has been gone for a while, and they come back and want to assume their role, and the family's kind of irritated and a bit angry that they kind of left for a while, then you can see how families might not recover as well. Next slide, please. C is a fair adjustment to the separation, and then a good adjustment to the reunion. Now you notice that they have the first crisis, and they start to come back, and then the soldier leaves again, and then they have a reunion, and then they recover, but not quite to where they were before. In D, the fourth one, the one at the bottom, you have a fair adjustment to separation and a poor adjustment to reunion. So they were functioning mediumly at first and had the crisis, and they came back almost to medium, but then they just didn't quite get it at the end, and now they're functioning poorly. Now let's move on to the next one. The last of the roller coaster models is a poor adjustment to separation, but a good adjustment to reunion. So they have this crisis, and they're in a trough for a while, but then everything kind of resolves itself, and now they're even doing better than they were before. Now you can see how the profile of trouble and the roller coaster model seem to be hand in hand, and that's because they're built on each other. However, Hill wasn't very satisfied with this model, and so in chapter 4, we'll see how he fixed it. Finally, let's begin to look at the the place where social work went with this. Okay, next slide. The family ecosystemic model, and you're going to do some work on understanding ecosystems, and then how ecosystems applies to family, and then a little bit thinking of family systems in this module. So after you finish with this and take the quiz, you'll move on to that stuff. But the family ecosystemic model said, look, a family is not just a collection of individuals cohabiting in the same space, but rather when this group of people comes together, something unique happens that makes the family greater than the sum of its individual members. And so in the family ecosystemic model, they began to think of stress in an ecosystems context. Again, this is an outdated model that got improved on later on, but let's look at this because you need to understand the history of how we got to where we are. The first process in the family ecosystemic model is the baseline level of functioning before the introduction of the stressor. So you see that top line at the left, the old normal level of organization. And then you see an arrow there, and the arrow is the input or the stressor, what happened to compromise the family's function. In a level 1 stress, they have a challenge, and they cope with it, and they start improving. Some families have a level 2 stress, and then they cope with it and start improving. And then some families have a third level of stress, and they try to come back, but you'll notice that they're really struggling in this diagram to get back to where they were before because of the multiple crises and multiple levels of crises that are happening to them. At the top right, you'll see the post-stress. So you see at the bottom, you got pre-stress, disorganization and coping, and post-stress. And so at the top right, you're seeing the post-stress condition. They're either doing better, the same, or worse. Okay, next slide, please. So after the input of the, after the old normal level, you have the input of the stressor, and that's a time when the stressor occurs. So this is an input into the family system, something that's entering the family system. And you notice that the input negatively impacts family coping. Next slide, please. After the input, you see the stress and coping pattern. So it's a transformational process that the family goes through to adapt to the stress that they're experiencing. And this stress is disrupting their normal processes, so it's forcing the family to do new things to adapt to the stress. Now that happens at level 1, level 2, and level 3. Now level 1 is where they make an attempt to reorganize themselves, and if they're successful, they reach recovery, and if not, they may actually experience more stress and move to the next level, level 2, which is now a crisis level. So they've moved from just being stressed to really being in crisis, which requires the family to do some restructuring if they hope to recover. And then a level 3 is where a family is just so deeply in crisis that they really need to rethink their family completely. They may be having a spiritual crisis or an existential crisis, making them question what life is all about, because it's such an overwhelming experience for them. Next slide, please. So in the 4th process, families then move to a new normal level of functioning. Families either return to where they were, develop new normal processes of perhaps doing better, or perhaps even doing worse. So once coping is complete, they return to this new level of functioning, this new normal. For our work as social workers, we look at crisis as an opportunity for change. Remember that we talked about the Chinese character for change is a combination of crisis and opportunity. A crisis prevents new opportunities for doing things in different ways. And frankly, until we're kind of shifted off balance, out of homeostasis by a crisis, we may be just content to do things the way our family's always done it. But once we experience crisis, then it's time to start rethinking how we do things, right? The deeper the level of crisis, level 1, level 2, level 3, the more we really have to think about what it means to be a family and how we need to operate differently. Now, some families don't do that. They just kind of live in the crisis of the moment and go from crisis to crisis. That's not a comfortable place to be, and frankly, it's something that we need to help families through, because we recognize that families can actually do better after crisis than they do in the crisis. Okay, with that said, I'm done lecturing for this module. I want you to move on to taking my quiz, and then reading about Cuse. It's a very short read that will kind of define his book for you. Couldn't find much on Hill for you, sorry about that, except for some really boring lectures that he gave. So I'm going to skip Hill, and then we'll go right into the ecosystems model. And you'll watch 3 videos, take a quiz. Now, don't forget to watch the movie, right? The movie about a family in stress, write a 1-page paper, which will be your discussion board, so it's not something new. Okay, folks, I will see you then on the flip side. Best of luck to you. Keep up the good work. Appreciate it.